Okay, here we are back again, and show me the future, Abraham Accords versus the Oslo Accords, a comparison of opposing approaches to dialogue. Now, as I will get to immediately, the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinian Authority under Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres as his deputy. Again, I personally belong to a segment of Israeli society who vehemently opposed the agreements in real time in 1991, 1992. As they were signed, we were opposed. It should be opposed to them. It should be said that the Orthodox community in America also opposed these agreements. When a party was made at the White House, the Orthodox organizations, Jewish Orthodox organizations, rabbinical organizations, refused to participate. They turned down an offer to come to the White House because we opposed these agreements. Today, again, I don't think I'm saying something controversial when I say this, that most people, the vast majority of Israelis, view the Oslo agreements as a failure. On all accounts, it did not it did not make peace. Again, at the most basic level, it did not make peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Heavy incitement is still taught in all segments of Palestinian education, if it's the schools, if it's the media, if it's the press. Of course, it should be said, for those who aren't familiar with the history, that after the Oslo Accords in year 2000, the Second Intifada broke out, which took the lives of over 2,000 Israelis and even more Palestinians. Many of those Israelis were my friends. Me and people in my segment of population have gone to many funerals of people who died in buses that exploded in Jerusalem, and people who were shot at and killed by snipers on their way home. The Palestinian police had used the weapons that Yitzhak Rabin had given to the Palestinian police to kill Israelis. It was, in other words, the Oslo Accords were a directly resulted in the murder of Israelis and in retaliatory attacks in the operation that Israel did, in the military operation that Israel did to clean out all the weapons. Even more Palestinians died, and of course, the Oslo Accords, in general, I would say, even hardcore leftists today will agree that the Oslo Accords were a failure, although, of course, we disagree on what exactly the failure was and what the dynamics were and how it could have been done better, or if it could have been done better. There are those who say that the Palestinian Authority are basically terrorists at heart, and therefore we should not have dealt with them. We should have dealt with other forces within the Palestinian society, more grassroots sources that represented the local clans of Palestinian society, who represented traditional forces and not radical elements such as the PLO and Yasser Arafat. Okay, as opposed to the Abraham Accords, which were signed last year between Israel and the Emirates and other Gulf states, Bahrain and other Oman and Saudi Arabia also did not join in the end, but they are in on some of these agreements. They almost joined in. So the Abraham Accords were done by the Netanyahu government and Donald Trump and the Gulf states. These are accords that are viewed, again, they are not very old, but they are viewed by most Israelis as a smashing success, as a brilliant success. Now the question is why? Of course, many people, of course, will blame the Palestinians. They will say that the Palestinians are a force, or a radical force throughout the entire Islamic world. And the Palestinians are radicals, but Arabs, ethnic Arabs in Oman or in the Emirates, they do not subscribe to the radical ideologies of the Palestinians. And therefore they are, pardon my saying this, they are more civilized forces. And we can have, to me personally, I must say that it was a lovely surprise to see Emiratis acting, openly, warmly, or openly, with open warmth towards Israelis who came to the Emirates. This could never have happened in the Palestinian Authority. Israelis, for those who aren't familiar, Israelis who go into Palestinian villages or Palestinian cities and are identified of Israelis are in immediate danger of being lynched. Every now and then unfortunately this has happened, and every now and then the Palestinian police who have some sort of security arrangements with Israel, they rescue Israelis who are in danger of being killed just for going into Palestinian cities such as Ramallah, again, not the most radical cities such as Gaza, in which Israelis do not even enter, but places like Ramallah. One can look up the horrible lynch that was done to two Israeli reserve soldiers in Ramallah. One can look at that. The pictures are terrible. I don't advise it, but okay. So let's try to analyze what the differences actually were between the Abraham Accords and the Oslo Accords. So again, like I said, besides the fact that these are two different forces within the Arab world, there were more, shall we say, differences of ideas and differences of approaches, and that is what I would like to address here. So the Abraham Accords were pro-traditional versus either non-traditional or anti-traditional forces in the Oslo Accords. What do I mean? Or conservatism versus the new Middle East approach of Shimon Peres and that kind of utopianism. Now, it should be said that the Abraham Accords, from their name, for instance, even from their name, Abraham, of course, is the joint father of the Jews and the Arabs, of what the Bible calls Yitzchak, Ishak in the Islamic tradition, and Ishmael. They were, we call in religious circles, we call Arabs our cousins. And as we know, the greatest feuds are within the family. So anyhow, but yes, so the Abraham Accords openly flaunted, they openly showcased the traditional elements of Jewish, Israeli, and Arab society. Whereas the Oslo Accords, again by their name, Oslo they were held in Oslo, in the capital of Norway, which is a fierce force of progressivism, of anti-traditional thought, and the people who initiated the Oslo Accords, Shimon Peres most notably, they were anti-traditional forces. They had negative opinions of Jewish tradition. Shimon Peres afterwards, when he lost the elections for prime minister, he said that the Jews defeated the Israelis. What he meant was that the right-wing camp was loyal to Jewish tradition, and his camp, the Israelis, so to speak, that's what he called it, were loyal to progressive values, to global values. Again, I dispute the fact that Israelis actually have to be identified. The term Israelis has to be identified with such forces. I define myself an Israeli, and I oppose such forces. But yes, that is the way Shimon Peres defined it. In his camp, there were many forces in the initiators of the Oslo Accords that represented such values, anti-traditional values, people who wanted separation of church and state, who wanted to use the Oslo Accords as a weapon against traditional elements, most notably against the Jewish settlers in the territories in Judea and Samaria. And again, as I said here, the Abraham Accords represented conservative values versus the values of the New Middle East that Shimon Peres said. And it should be pointed out here that the talk of New Middle East is horrifying to the vast majority of Arabs. The vast majority of Arabs, again, I believe it was Assad who said this, or Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, who said that Hafez al-Assad said that New Middle East means that we will have to stop being Arabs, and this is horrifying to traditional societies such as the Arabs, and it is also horrifying for religious Jews such as myself. I will not stop being a Jew. Me and my likes will never abandon Jewish tradition just because some elites in New York or London or whatever it was say we have to. So the Abraham Accords in this sense supported traditional values, and it is not an accident that the ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is an Orthodox Jew, and so is Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, etc. Okay, and the next way of analyzing the difference would be the difference between grassroots elements and globalist elites, sovereign governments versus international interventionalism. So, as I said beforehand, grassroots, the traditional elements, versus globalist, like an alliance of globalist elites that Shimon Peres fantasized about, if I may say that. And it is also a question of sovereign government. Can Israel define its own interests, or do we have to, bow down before some sort of international community, Western powers? Again, this is, of course, a very important issue in India, in the issue of Kashmir. India fiercely opposes the internationalizing of Kashmir, which is what the Pakistanis try to do, making Pakistan an issue of global human rights, etc., things like that. So again, this is also an issue of national sovereignty. Now, nowadays, even though it was not clear to many at the times of the Oslo Accords, we're talking about the early 90s, nowadays there is a Red-Green Alliance. As I've said in the previous video, Red-Green Alliance are a threat to world peace with strong influences within Western elites and governments. The Red-Green Alliance, I am referring to the alliance which at face value might might be counterintuitive between socialist forces and progressive forces. Again, the boundaries are not always clear between what is socialist and what is progressive, but boundary between these forces and the alliance between these forces and radical Islamic forces, if they are in Europe, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has only recently been outlawed in many European countries. And and organizations like Hamas or even Revolutionary Iran. As I spoke in the previous clip, there are forces in the American government that are trying to make peace with Iran. Again, this is not a peace in which Revolutionary Iran says, "Oh yes, we love democracy, we love human rights." This is a peace in which America is actually, in many ways, aligning itself with trying to align itself with Revolutionary Iran. And with Hamas, also Barack Obama, it should be said, in the what was called back then the Arab Spring, aligned himself with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt against his erstwhile allies in the government of Hosni Mubarak. And this was viewed with extremely negatively by Arab states who viewed America as traitorous towards Arab countries. They said, we, the leaders of the Arab world, we might not be Democrats, but we are keeping these violent radical forces, we are keeping them at bay. And all of a sudden, Barack Obama says, okay, the radicals are great, the Islamic Brotherhood, they are great. It doesn't. Somehow, Barack Obama was blind to the fact that Islamic Brotherhood would have inevitably caused the death of Copts in Egypt, and would most probably have started a war with Israel sooner or later. So again, I believe that these alliances are a threat to world peace. Again, most people think of America as a positive global force. Many people think of America as a positive global force, depending on who you are. Some view it negatively. But for many years, America was a positive global force, not only as an ally of Israel or an ally of South Korea, but again, America had if we had to choose between America and the Soviet Union, it was very clear which country brought more prosperity and more peaceful regimes. It was America and not the Soviet Union. So again, I think these alliances must be discussed. It is, of course, politically dangerous to discuss this kind of alliance openly in many Western medias and forums, but I think it should be discussed. Okay, so these are different ways I analyze the differences, and here I get to the more immediate issue of Pakistan and Palestine, Palestinians. There is, of course, no state of Palestine, and there never was historically, but I just brought it here as a term. These are countries, as I touched upon before, they have violent ideologies. The state ideologies of these countries are openly violent. If it is Hamas, which openly says that the Jews are an impure force, the Jews are nijis, they are contaminating the land of Israel. They say this in their constitution, in their founding documents, that the Jews defile Israel, the holy land of Israel, the holy waqf of Israel, by their presence here, and they have to be just get them out of here, like Gamal Abdel Nasser talked of throwing the Jews into the sea. That is basically what Hamas believes. And it should also be stated that the Palestinian Authority, the so-called moderates, they also openly teach violence against Jews in their schools. They glorify murderers such as Dalal al-Mughrabi and others who are murderers. They murdered Israeli children. People like Samir Kuntar, the Lebanese terrorists, they are openly glorified by Palestinian forces, not only by Lebanese Hezbollah. And the same thing, of course, in Pakistan, in which India is viewed as an enemy force, and they sponsor violence, encounters along the border, etc. But the wild irony is that these forces somehow they have a reputation of being Gandhian. It's as if the Palestinians are like these lovely, peaceful people, and if only the Jews would stop murdering them, committing genocide. It's a very interesting form of genocide. The Arab population in Israel and in the territories has doubled many times over since the founding of Israel. We have connected them to electric and water. Even though in the refugee camps, for instance, the Palestinians have refused to be connected to electric and water, and the sewage continues to run in the streets there because they want to. Again, we have offered them many times over in the Gaza Strip, etc. They want to maintain this status in order to radicalize the refugee camps. This is again the organization of UNRWA, of Palestinian refugees, works to perpetuate the radicalization of Palestinian society. And yet, people will never see this. They will overlook and only say, Israel builds in settlements, and India is a fascist state under the BJP, which is, of course, even, India, again, fascist is an outrageous term. If you're looking at what the state ideologies are in Pakistan, of course, they are openly violent. When people talk about violence against the Muslim minorities in India, it should be said that far more Muslims are killed in Pakistan, their own citizens, than in India. Okay, so again, people have to get the facts straight, regardless of propaganda or political interests of the superpowers. So the question I want to ask here is, what is the correct Red-Green Alliance, what is the correct battlefield for victory? If we see that these radical Western elements, the radical left, is aligned with the radical Islam, what is the correct battlefield? Is it warfare, defeating them in the battlefield? Is it lawfare, as the Israeli government, one can look at the book Harpoon by Nitzana Darshan Leitner, who successfully, with the help of the Mossad, they had a unit called Harpoon in the Mossad, Tziltzal in Hebrew. It was a unit that was tracking the funding of terrorist organizations and cutting them off from international banking system, and it was very successful in cutting off the funding of many of these organizations, and also pursuing the banks, the Arab Bank from Jordan, pursuing them in courts of law for funding terrorism. These were very successful operations. In many ways, they were more successful than warfare, because if the terrorists cannot receive their funds, they cannot reach the battlefield in the first place. Another battlefield, of course, has to be the media, films, academia. Of course, these are arenas in which the left has large prominence, and as I said beforehand, radical Islam has infiltrated establishments like the Middle Eastern Studies organizations in America. But again, these battlefields cannot be deserted, and of course, in the film industry, in India there is a much more prominence of right-wing elements in the film industry. Again, I personally think propaganda, open propaganda, violent propaganda even, should be avoided. I think we have to, art is art, but art should not call for violence. But again, we have to set the facts straight on these issues, and art is, of course, a medium that should be pursued. Another question is, what can diplomacy accomplish? In other words, can a peace agreement be achieved, for instance, between India and Pakistan? Many people will say it is impossible. Again, this is a question that has to be asked. What realistically can be accomplished in the short term or in the long term? What does victory look like? What would victory look like for India or for Israel? An interesting comparison would be the concept of Akan Bharat, the greater India, and greater Israel. And it's an interesting comparison because in Israel, we talk about greater Israel, about annexing the territories. Israel, of course, is a small country with much smaller population than India. But the concept of Akan Bharat is not on the platform of any Indian political party. No one talks about annexing, forget about Pakistan and the radicals, but even Bangladesh. No one talks about reuniting with Bangladesh. Even though it is Bharat Mata, it is the holy land of India, the holy land and the motherland, etc. But no one talks about reuniting with Bangladesh, whereas in Israel, these ideas are discussed. So this is an interesting comparison. The question is, what does victory look like? Even if we have short-term goals, it is obvious that we will not reunite with Bangladesh tomorrow. Is it a goal? Do we have a long-term goal of actually doing that? And of course, the question that has to be addressed is, let's say we have a goal of disarming Pakistan through reuniting with them. If India, let's propose a situation in which India would be such a wildly successful country that Pakistanis would want to reunite, there would be an issue of de-radicalization. Of course, this is an issue that has to be discussed with the Palestinians. They have grown up with a wild hatred of Jews, and these are millions of people who have grown up with this hatred. Again, we know that the comparison, one can ask himself whether the comparison is complete, but whether the similarities are complete. But after World War II, there was an aggressive process of denazification of Germany, which people or of Imperial Japan. They actually made the Emperor of Japan go on live radio and declare that he was not a god. So there has to be a way of breaking the radicalization of large populations. This, of course, would also be the case if North Korea was to reunite with South Korea. And this is a major issue, how to effectively do this. I think it has to be done and should be done, but it is obviously not easy to do. Someone who grew up on decades of radicalization cannot be de-radicalized just by saying so. And of course, the economics of normalization. If India were to reunite with Pakistan, or if Israel was to annex and give citizenship to all Palestinians, and if everyone was successfully de-radicalized, the economics would not be simple of bringing them up to a standard of living that we all want them. I believe we all want them to have a healthcare, welfare, etc. Okay, so these are all issues on the specific cases of Pakistan and the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so there we have it now. We have discussed issues of Islam and our respective countries.